Hi, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us today. This is a conversation about free speech. I think we can all agree a topic that has been made even more urgent by this invasion of democratic Ukraine, by Russia, an autocratic regime that has been relentlessly assaulting the truth and the news media. We see Vladimir Putin working hard to perpetuate disinformation, propaganda, and his regime is silencing independent voices at a time when the stakes could not be higher. So joining us for this conversation today about freedom of speech and the need to fearlessly write and report, I'm very excited to welcome our two guests, Joanne Leedom-Ackerman and Salil Tripathi. Joanne is a novelist, short story writer, and journalist. She's also an ICFJ board director, which we're delighted to have her. And she is a longtime leader at PEN International, holding many positions, and she's currently Vice President Emeritus. Her latest book is called PEN Journeys, Memoir of Literature on the Line, and that focuses on the stories of very brave authors and journalists around the world and her experience supporting them. Salil's also joining us. He is a writer, journalist, and board member of PEN International, and like Joanne, a former chair of PEN International's Writers in Prison Committee. Salil's also a contributing editor at Mint and Caravan in India, and he has been a correspondent for many publications based in India, Singapore, London, and now in New York. So let's get started, and feel free to put your questions in the chat. We'll get to them as we go along, and more so toward later in the conversation, but feel free to start putting them in and we will get to those as we can. So I want to start with a question for Joanne and your book. It really reflects a time, and that's how I felt reading it, when the world was opening up. The Berlin Wall had fallen, the Soviet Union broke apart, democracies were ascendant around the globe, and now we're seeing this horrific war in Ukraine. We're seeing Russia's crackdown. We're seeing a demonstrated decline in democracy around the world over the last 15 years. So how do you feel seeing all this? Are we going backwards? What does the landscape look like now as we see this erosion of democracy, and what happens to freedom of speech in that regard?
Okay, well, let me, if I may, widen the aperture of that question and spend just a minute looking at how PEN began, because it began at a time when the world was even more fraught, right after World War I. And, Europe and all over the world were really despairing. And there was a need writers felt to just know each other. And so a few English writers, John Galsworthy, Catherine Amy Dawson Scott, got together and said, if we could just see and talk to each other when we travel, perhaps we can help tamp down some of the nationalism that brought on World War I. And very quickly, PEN, these was clubs at the time, spread. And these writers began meeting throughout Europe, then in America, then in Latin America, in Asia, and then in Africa. And the idea was that a community of writers, because writers are the first ones in a country, in a community, that are looking at the facts, giving the narrative of the situation, and the first ones when an authoritarian government doesn't like it, that are often put in prison and clamped down on. So the genesis of PEN was in a fraught time. World War II came. The German PEN at the time was not protesting Hitler, so they were thrown out of PEN. So PEN has always been in a time of conflict. And if you, in this book, you just see the narratives in the Congresses sort of go from, the Balkans to, conflicts in Africa, conflicts in the Middle East. But everywhere, always, there are writers trying to shape what that narrative is, find the facts, find the truth, which is often elusive. And so that's the frame. But you're right, when I was writing the book and rereading it, I was realizing it was an optimistic time. And just before we were talking, is this because it really was, or I was just younger? I mean, that's hard. It's hard to know sometimes. Because actually in this time, while the Soviet Union was falling, the Berlin Wall had been knocked down. My children and I went and helped knock down the Berlin Wall. In that sort of smoke and times, underneath the surface, other things were happening. Saddam Hussein was gathering weapons of mass destruction. The Balkans were about to explode. So right now we need to be very alert, because everybody's focused where we're focused. In the smoke of all that, very possibly other things are happening. And just one more thought, I think, maybe to help frame our discussion, in looking at this and looking at the countries Penn works for, the writers Penn works with and for, you begin to see that in authoritarian countries, the state is organized to protect itself from its citizens. It puts writers in prison. It takes you away if you don't agree with the state. In democratic societies, the state is organized to protect its citizens, and it's a very big difference. And you can almost look down, put countries on either side, and the key of the citizen is they're the voice of the people being governed, and foremost among citizens that articulate this are the writers. And I think that's why Penn, through various times, has gone on. And as we were talking beforehand, Penn is mainly a volunteer organization of writers around the world working on each other's behalf, being the voice when a writer's in prison and can't speak, to be their voice, their megaphone, to protest on their behalf, to share their literature, to translate literature. And it's a community of writers. So I chaired the Writers in Prison Committee, which is sort of the human rights part of Penn, for 4 years. I never met Salil, though I was a member of English Penn. I went on, I was the international secretary, and I didn't meet Salil till 2015, but he was taking up the torch and doing the same thing. So there are always other writers there that take on the work to work for other writers. And that's, in this time, however depressing the time is, that's an inspiring element of the times, I think.
No, that's great. Let me ask you this, and start with maybe Salil on this, which is, let's define our terms. What is freedom of speech? Is it absolute? What are we fighting for when we say freedom of speech? Because sometimes it is a balancing act. Salil, maybe you want to take that first?
Yes, there is a balancing act. I don't deny that. I mean, I love the First Amendment in the US. I love the way Sweden and Norway look at freedom of expression, and I love the way Netherlands also looks at it. I grew up in India, where, just as the US First Amendment actually prevents the state from passing laws that restrict free speech, in India, the First Amendment of the Constitution actually allowed the state to intervene and stop, and for what were described as good reasons, such as maintaining communal harmony, not having bad relationships with neighboring governments, making sure there's public order and morality protected and prevailed and all that, which are states' duties, of course. So, but freedom of speech, can it be completely uncluttered and unrestrained? And even the US will tell you that the answer is no. When there's a clear and present danger of imminent violence, there is a case for the state to intervene and stop it. And, we can go deeper into it and try to unravel and distinguish between what is hate speech and dangerous speech. If we try to distinguish between that, then there's a very clear case that, hate speech, let it be spoken. Hate speech is speech you hate very often. People call, because they disagree with what you're saying, they go, oh, that's hate speech. No, that's something you disagree with. But dangerous speech is when it is a person in power or authority or has some kind of a credibility with the audience, playing on an old grievance, reminding people that that grievance needs to be set right in the absence of alternative modes of communication, and exhorting people to take the law in their hands and possibly become violent. The way Milosevic spoke in 1987 and 88 and 89 in the Balkan, that is dangerous speech. Radio Rwanda is dangerous speech. It's not, it goes beyond that. So yes, there are times when there should be restrictions. I mean, the whole, the way fake news and hate speech has gone on. I mean, there are serious questions about what can and cannot be said about, the effectiveness of vaccines. Should there be restriction on people who are continuously denying? And if yes, and there are two views about it. And clearly there has to be something that is science-led that goes on. But when I think about freedom of speech, there are two issues that matter here, which again takes us into the realm of who controls the waves on which we speak. One is the freedom to reach. It's all right to speak, but if you're denied the right to speak, or if you're shadow banned on Twitter or Facebook so that your message is not carried out, there is a problem there. And what's very important, and this goes back to the point Joanne was making about distinguish between democracies and authoritarian government, we also have to question the notion of democracy, because it's not simply important about freedom of speech, but freedom after speech. And I think what seems to be increasingly happening in many democracies is that once you've said something, the writer, he or she faces dangers. And this happens in many countries where the countries hold elections but are not democracies. They have newspaper without freedom of speech. They have a court, but no rule of law. They have a parliament, but no effective opposition. And I think we're increasingly going into that area where the functions are taken away, but the structures are there. And therefore, we confuse those countries to be democracies merely because they hold elections.
Yeah. Also, I think it's important, and this debate on censorship it has always been there. I mean, it's always been there with Penn, it's been with others. But one way of thinking about it that sometimes is helpful is if the person who is articulating hate speech has the power to do something about it, that is a very different thing than if a poet, for instance, says, I don't like XYZ, or I hate, or I even want to kill XYZ. And so the power of the state is important here. And we are different in the US very often when we have debates in Europe or in Africa, because we have our First Amendment, which is what's much more absolute. They've lived through times where hate speech propagated big wars. So there's not one clear answer, but one interesting thing in a democracy is people learn to deal with conflicting ideas. There's not one ideology that everybody has to agree with. So you learn to deal with, even in Penn's charter, there's the conflict. One, the free transmission of ideas, free expression, and two is respecting and respecting others and no hatred. And sometimes those come in conflict. We've had the issues with Charlie Hebdo or with the Danish cartoons that happened in the 2000s. The lack of respect versus the free speech. Usually, free expression wins out in our paradigm.
Mm. No, and that's something that Salman Rushdie has often said, right, in this context, that if you don't write a book, shut it, argue with it, write a better book, challenge the book, challenge that idea, but don't ban it, and certainly don't go after the writer. And I think the same applies with the Charlie Hebdo case, that, if you don't like those cartoons, you don't have to buy the magazine, you don't have to go and, but to try to see it as a response to the bombing of the West in Iraq is a bit of a stretch, which some people did try to make, and therefore saying that this anger was understandable. No, the cartoonists should never have been killed. Yeah.
There was interesting. I was just listening in doing some research yesterday of a Bosnian journalist who was ready. She was a young woman. It was Sarajevo. She was in Sarajevo. She just had been there 2 years, seeing no impact of her work, and was ready to sort of leave. And she was interviewing a 90-year-old man who had spent his whole life there. He'd been a boy there in World War II. And she mentioned it, and she said, well, why didn't people do things? And he said, because they didn't know, but you are here to let people know. And she said it really just infused her with her purpose and understanding what her purpose was as a journalist, is to let people know. So if you close off letting people know, and of course that's the challenge right now in Russia, when you close down all the avenues where the citizens can know what's happening, it leads to one road.
So another interesting, and I say that not necessarily saying interesting is good, but interesting thing happening now is the banning of sites, right? Russia, as you pointed out, is banning news sites. It's created laws to close the ones that are trying to exist. But you also see in the West, for Britain and others, for example, Russia Today is also being sort of deplatformed, to use that term. What are your thoughts about that? Obviously, news sites and state propaganda are not the same thing, of course, but how do you balance that?
Well, I think one thing, and I'm just saying this to somebody who sent me an article they were writing, we have to be very clear of equivalences. That both things are happening, but they're not necessarily equivalent. So Russia passing laws that if you call it a war, you can go to prison for 15 years, even if you're a foreign correspondent, is one kind of banning. And that's the state doing it with really repressive journalistic laws. Russia Today being taken off the air is not, and I am not fully knowledgeable about how that's happening in every country, so I can't say, but that is my understanding, that those are companies deciding not to give them the platform. That's not a government saying you can't hear Russia Today. That's whatever platforms they're on that they broadcast, saying we're not going to broadcast you anymore. That's different. I mean, it needs to be considered differently. I can't say right or wrong, but I don't have the right to go broadcast on unless somebody gives me a platform to do that. Somebody has to think I'm worthy of doing that. So there's a state separation of the media, and in Russia right now there is not a state separation in some of these acts. So I can't give you an absolute answer, but I do think we have to think about these things correctly. Salil, I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
No, I think in the British case, at least, the ministers have said that they would want to use the powers within the Ofcom and all the methodologies that they have in power to take the RT out of the channel, and they do have the power to do that if they wish. And I think they may have already done that, because Nadine Dorries is very keen to have open what she called the third front, which is to try to have sports, cultural, and artistic boycotts, which is increasingly the norm. I believe Oprah Winfrey's book club has decided to drop Tolstoy, and I think the Cardiff Philharmonic has just announced that they won't play Tchaikovsky. And I mean, I know Tchaikovsky is dead, but maybe he did influence Putin. I mean, who knows? And and Tolstoy did write War and Peace, so maybe Oprah thinks that it's all about this war. I mean, who knows? So these are the kind of, I mean, I'm being facetious here.
But those are challenges. That's a real challenge. You start.
But those are the challenges. Those are the stupid bans that the West is implementing as we go.
Yeah.
But it is going to happen. The difference, I think, is this: that if you really are determined in London or in Berlin or in any of the Western capitals to watch Russia today through a virtual private network or something, you will be able to do so. And if you do, nobody's going to come knock at your door and take you away and jail you. In Russia, that's not the case. And that's the key difference between the two societies.
Yeah. And you need to have contrasting ideas. I mean, it'd be nice, even though the Kremlin, I'm told, runs Russia today, it could be interesting for us to know what they're saying and thinking. We don't have to be afraid of ideas, but we do have to,
because if you're afraid of the idea, that means we feel our idea is weak, and freedom is strong. It doesn't. I mean, it never should need defense, but if it needs defense, we should embrace it rather than say that that it's something that needs to be protected all the time. Yeah.
Well, let's dig into disinformation, I guess, and propaganda a little bit more. Joanne, you wrote in your book that PEN members have faith that words matter and can have power for good or ill, that there is a difference between words that aim for truth and words that are used for propaganda. So how do we deal with disinformation then? I hear what you're saying about, we need to be open to ideas, but what does that mean about combating, as we like to say, disinformation? How do those two balance each other out?
It's a challenge, and in PEN itself, I mean, during the Balkans War, some of the most nationalistic and aggressive constructors of that war were writers and were PEN members. It's very rare for PEN to say you can't be a member, but these people, got taken out of the organization. I can't even think. There may be a few occasions, but I can't think of an occasion where I think a writer should be put in prison for what they write. I just don't think. Now, there can be civil cases. There certainly can be suits against them if they've slandered somebody, if they said misinformation. But I don't think the criminal tact is where we go. But we have to be very alert, and we have to really match the bad facts with what are the true facts. We have to monitor that and do that. And I know in my experience with, my role in PEN, the Balkans War was very challenging for that reason, because hate speech was coming up into it. The writers were involved with it. It was a competition of ideas. But once they took power and executed their ideas and people began dying, then they go to The Hague. I mean, I love one of the signs I saw in Ukraine where they changed all the street signs and all the arrows go to The Hague, the street signs. So, I mean, there are times when bad ideas lead to really bad actions, and then the actions themselves can be punished.
Well, as Salil, you eloquently said before, sort of the difference too between dangerous speech, I guess, and hate speech and other kinds of speech. What are your thoughts? And Salil, I want to pull in maybe sort of the role of the social media platforms here, because obviously that is a big issue, disinformation on them. Some people come down on the role that they should be free speech absolutists, right? People need to can say what they want to say. They're trying to combat the most dangerous, they claim. But what are your thoughts about the role of the platforms in this?
So the platforms wanted both ways, right? On one hand, they want to claim that they're only carriers of data, like roads, so therefore they're not responsible for traffic and how you drive on the road. They've just built the road for you. But at the same time, they have service conditions, they have policies, they have hate speech policies, they have policies about child pornography, they have policies about, publishing stuff. So of course they are censoring and monitoring. So they should get out of this, disabuse themselves of this notion that they are neutral carriers. They are not. They are taking a stand. Then the question is, how do they go about it? And the problem here is that, their model is based on engagement of the viewers. Because I read certain kinds of things, the algorithm then tries to figure out that, okay, Salil is liberal, and therefore let's give him something slightly left of center or slightly more left of center, and then push me further and further into things that glue me and pull me into an arena where I see more and more the so-called dark side of the internet, whether it's on the left or the right. And which is how, when you might be on a kind of central path, end up moving the other way. Now, in the past, because we were reading newspapers, and a newspaper had to take advertising from everybody, and it needed to sell a very large market, which was undifferentiated, newspapers came up with this very practical idea, that we need to have an opinion page where, we have present all points of view. But the algorithm-led internet allows you to sidestep that, and you can actually zone in and target messages in a particular way. So the responsibility, in fact, becomes even more important on whether it is Spotify or YouTube or Facebook or Twitter, to ensure that there is equal access. Now, I'm not saying therefore reinvent the fairness doctrine of FCC, but I think there is a need to make sure that the alternate view is, and that does not mean, as it happened in the Spotify case recently, where Joe Rogan and people started pulling out and so on, that okay, we will give an alternative view. Now, that does not mean simply a link that you click on and see the other thing, because after you've been roused for 3 hours by one kind of rhetoric, you're not going to say, oh, but let me check the other side. I think there is a role that the platforms have to learn from newspapers and magazines, which did know that they're to present both sides, but ultimately came down and said, however, this is the truth. There is old adage in British journalism, that if one side says it's sunny and the other side says it is raining, the role of the newspaper is not to say on the one hand, on the other hand, but to open the window and see whether it's sunny or raining and say so. And I think that's what is not happening. And for that, the platforms have to play an increasingly important role, which they cannot do on their own. They have to do it by having the kind of council of wise men, women, people, who can guide their decisions. As Facebook has done with this, appeals panel, but that's only the edge. At the top. You need a lot more than that, and you need a lot more training internally within the platforms about history, about politics, about law, about constitution, about human rights, about culture, and take appropriate decisions.
Interesting. We will see what happens. We've got a question from one of the attendees who is interested in your comment on how you view the detainment/imprisonment of Julian Assange over this last decade. Either you want to take that one?
Yeah. I'm happy to do that, because Penn is against his extradition. We have very categorically said that, because there is a potential death penalty involved. And I think anything that targets Assange for his role as someone who was publishing something which the government did not want published is something that is a fair, straightforward free speech issue. The troubles that Assange had in Sweden is a separate issue altogether. Whether or not he had sexually assaulted 2 women or not, and the Swedish prosecutor's decision, that's a separate issue altogether. So I think we do need to decouple the 2 cases. So I think Assange, as declared or deemed as a publisher of WikiLeaks, and therefore performing what he thinks of is an enabling a whistleblower to reach the wider world, that's a legitimate role which any newspaper would have done. That's why a lot of newspapers are also against that specific prosecution of Assange. But the other part about it, that's his private matter, and I think Penn wouldn't have a view, and Penn wouldn't want to get involved there.
Wouldn't want to get involved in that.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
I might just add, just structurally within Penn, not every center has the same opinion all the time.
Yes.
And centers are autonomous, so they can act accordingly. We do gather once a year and have resolutions that people can vote for or not, then the whole organization comes behind it. But sometimes these cases that are controversial or people don't have the same opinion, those centers that are very adamant on it will act in one way and the others may not engage, because people standing in different shoes in different parts of the world.
Yeah, but free speech, right? Not everybody's freedom of opinion. Not everybody has the same one, obviously. I want to talk a little bit about, or just go back to sort of the media environment we live in now. And Joanne, particularly the fatwa, the Iranian fatwa against Salman Rushdie back in 1988. At that time, Joanne, you wrote, what sets the case of Salman Rushdie apart is the globalization of the attack. And boy, are we a lot more globalized today. Yeah. I'm wondering, a little thought experiment, but how might that situation have played out differently in 2022? Would it have been a different animal in some ways, better or worse, none of the above?
Well, I think part of it would depend on if it had happened before. By 2022, we're all sitting in different consciousness and headspace, and a lot has happened. So back then, at least in the U.S. and I think in a good part of Europe, probably in other continents as well, people didn't even know what a fatwa was. So, all we knew is that somebody had threatened a writer anywhere he was in the world and put a bounty on his head. And that, that was highly unusual. And PEN globally just organized around that and saw the importance of resisting that. And saw the importance of encouraging bookstores, publishers, and everything to resist it too, because bookstores started taking his books off the shelves. Nobody knew what it was because the Ayatollah threatened those who translated, in fact, had some of those killed, and promoted Rushdie's book. So it was a scary time, and it was a learning curve, just a huge learning curve, I think, globally for what a friend of mine wrote a book called Sacred Rage, and I think that sort of summed up what it was. But we were all learning that. We hadn't seen that before. And we just knew it. We knew, I think, anybody involved in PEN. And at the time I was president of a center. So I absolutely knew it was time to mobilize and connect the dots all around the globe.
I remember asking Paddy Ashdown, who was a leader, Liberal Democrat politician in the UK and later Office of High Representative in Bosnia. And Lib Dems had taken a very strong stand supporting Salman Rushdie. And I remember once talking to him about it, and he said, but was there another option? There was no option. There were people who tried to explain away satanic verses by saying, but he should have known. No, he should not have known. He had written a novel, and he was giving vent to his imagination and creativity and creating a very powerful book, which was about globalization, about the origin of truth and meaning and faith and doubt. That's what it was about. And somebody distorts it, and you cannot therefore have to say that, therefore you have to curb your imagination. It was an assault not just on the writer, but our ability to imagine. I think that was one of the major problems with the fatwa. But and you're right, the Japanese translator was murdered, and our good mutual friend, William Nygard, was shot at, the publisher in Norway. So there have been these issues like this that have happened, which are profoundly problematic. But what would we do in 2022? I would look at it slightly differently, that if there had been a fatwa on a novel like Satanic Verses a few years earlier, if we had already known the situation, such as Charlie Hebdo, I believe a lot of writers would be wanting to not self-censor, but think twice before writing something that's enormously controversial. And it is not just that, it's even in journalism, Daphne Caruana Galizia and Anna Politkovskaya and Gauri Lankesh in India. There are all these wonderful women journalists who have been murdered because they've been saying things which somebody somewhere does not like. That rule has changed. I remember, I was a reporter in Southeast Asia before, and part of the Wall Street Journal group. And one of the persons I'd interacted with a few times was Danny Pearl. And then, of course, I left and moved to London. But Danny went to Pakistan. And when he was in Pakistan, he was trying to meet somebody because there was this pact that however, while a creature you are interviewing, you're going with your notebook and your pencil, and you're only going to write and ask questions and take that story out. And in return, you had safety, and that pact was broken. So I think a lot of the things that we took for granted and assumed that, simple writing, simple act of stating the truth is fine, that has been changed because state actors and non-state actors both do not like freedom of expression.
Yeah. Also, the whole act of writing is to try to leap over one's experience, which inevitably is limited, and try to imagine who this other is and find out the bridges so that they're not another. So it is an act of imagining and reimagining. And if you look at where peace is going to come in the world, I don't see how it comes unless we can imagine the other, who we think is the other, and realize that we are all, as PEN's charter says, one humanity, trying to work in peace.
That's a good segue actually into another question we have here, which in terms of imagining the other, this speaks to directly sort of the news coverage right now on the invasion in Ukraine. And it says the media has faced criticism for the way they make comparisons between Ukrainian refugees and Syrian and African ones. What are your thoughts on how this has been presented and how it could be improved?
I think some of the coverage has been quite bad. I think there have been some television stations which have said, oh, these are not like, refugees because they're blue-eyed and blonde. I think is what somebody had said in one particular case. And clearly their ethnicity and what they look like is influencing a lot of governments. I mean, Poland and Hungary were all erecting barriers when the Syrians wanted to come, and they are bringing them down and letting Ukrainians in, and which is fine. Of course, Ukrainians deserve, I mean, everybody who is a refugee should be allowed in. But what we must remember is that, yes, while we are seeing a duplicity on the European side here, and some media is complicit in it, but the way it is talking about it, we should also remember that, when the refugees were coming, some media were actually attacking the refugees. I mean, British tabloid press is notorious for calling them bogus asylum seekers, vermins, and pests, and all kinds of bizarre terminology. There was a case in Hungary where there was this one television broadcaster. She tripped refugees as they were coming, and and it was all captured on camera, if you remember, from 4 or 5 years ago when the Syrian refugees were coming. And it's not simply a European problem. I also want to recognize what India has done with its own refugee laws, because India did not sign the Refugee Convention on one hand, but it still observed the spirit, which is why Dalai Lama could be in India, which is why Sri Lankan Tamils could be in India, which is why Afghans could be in India, and Burmese students could be in India. So Mint, who hijacked a plane carrying, I think, a guava or a mango, claiming it was a grenade. This is in 1988. I'm talking about almost a century ago, it looks like. But when all that happened, India was accepting these people as refugees. But now it has changed the rule and law that if you're from the neighborhood, unless you're a persecuted religious minority, you are not fast-tracked as a refugee, which means it's basically an anti-Muslim law. Because if you're a Hindu, Sikh, Jain, Buddhist, or Parsi from Afghanistan, Bangladesh, or Pakistan, you kind of get fast-tracked into it. Now, of course, those people are being persecuted, but Sharon, you worked in India too. I mean, Pakistan does not only pick on non-Muslims when it persecutes. I mean, if you're a Shia, if you're an Ahmadi, you're a gay rights activist, if you're a female women's rights activist, and you happen to be a Muslim, they're not going to get spared at all. So I think there is something fundamentally flawed in the way we are seeing refugees, and it's across the board. But right now, quite rightly, the focus is on Ukraine.
Also, I think, you can't get away from the fact that you have contiguous countries welcoming people from a contiguous country. So there is a cultural affinity, and the challenge is, how deep that alienation goes to those that are not in contiguous countries. But this crisis also represents a real threat of a major nuclear superpower taking over a whole swath of land and then continuing. And so it represents even more than the Ukraine to a lot of people, because, how accurate, I don't know, but in some leaked documents, Putin said, and then next will be Moldova, and then will be so and so. So it's sort of I don't want to say we have our thumb in our dike, because it's a pretty big hole in the dike right now, but I think it's global politics as well as local politics. But yes, I mean, just a few months ago, we had the debacle of the U.S. exiting Afghanistan and all of those refugees and trying to find places for those. And in Syria, if you remember at the beginning when the Syrian refugee happened, Germany took 1 million refugees. I mean, there were open doors, but then it just continued. It didn't stop, and people got weary. I think at first, Lebanon, Germany, other places, Portugal. I remember going and visiting some refugee camps, and the Portuguese came trying to lure people to come to Portugal from Syria. But when it went on and on and on, then the dynamic changed.
I'd like that it has changed a lot, and you all brought up, I think, a little bit earlier, the idea of self-censorship, not just sort of bad, but the article, not written, the movie not made, the book not written, the comment not uttered. And I'd like to talk a little bit about that now, because that is obviously a big detriment to freedom of speech. India, Salil, of course, as you've seen, a huge amount of self-censorship in the Indian media as Modi has become more authoritarian. How much of a problem do you see this now in sort of the battle for free speech in India and other places in the world? And what do you do about it? People have a real fear of consequences.
Yes, the fears of consequences are real. I mean, at a very practical and dismaying level, what has happened is that some people are deserting social media because the noise that they face in terms of attacks is just so relentless, so personal, and particularly if you're a female journalist, a woman journalist, and the kind of doxing and the kind of deep fake images being used to humiliate the person is of course unacceptable, but that's a very mild term to use here. And there needs to be something sterner and stricter against that, clearly. But yeah, there is clearly, I mean, people are watching their words about what they say, particularly if it involves specific businesses and specific political leaders. And businesses, because Indian corporations in the past used to ignore when they were criticized. You could write a piece about land grab by a particular business group and, people will just disregard it. But today you're given a straightforward $1 billion lawsuit because the argument would be that we are all listed, the listed companies are listed on NASDAQ or New York Stock Exchange or raise capital abroad. And this makes us look very poor. And therefore we are going to go after you and hit you where the pocketbook is going to hurt you. And there is that kind of an attack. So when you're writing something about a corporation or businesses or business politics nexus, people are becoming very careful, the way they were in Malaysia, Indonesia, and Singapore, where I used to work in the past. So I can see that kind of attitude coming in. And the opposition pretty much, and quite frankly, comes from stand-up comedians these days. They are the ones who are, it's a bit like John Oliver versus the Republican Party, it's or for that matter, Jon Stewart versus George W. Bush, as it was at one point. And there is a bit of that here that, you have these stand-up comedians taking up. But, and this is where there's always hope, right? And where I'm optimistic is that there are some portals which are doing very good work. There's Scroll, there is Wire, there is Article 14, which looks at rule of law and human rights. There are other Bar and Bench and Leaflet, which look at law again in a very, very detailed manner. And a truly heartwarming site is the one that may win the Oscar Awards, the film Writing with Fire, which is about this exceptional media venture called Khabar Lahriya, which is run by Dalit women, and they are doing superb reporting from the ground. There's another thing called Pari Network, which is People's Archive for Rural India. So there's a lot of great journalism happening, which is quite bold, quite strong, fact-checking website, but it's all in the virtual sphere. So the extent to which it becomes popular depends on the virality that follows from that. But a lot of newspapers don't even cover these things when they happen.
But also, Sharon, can I just add one element? Also, there's a financial censorship. And I know in terms of China, because China is such a funder of Hollywood, the American Pen has put out a really good report on what that has meant in the creation of movies and all. And so, screenwriters and others can no longer make China the villain, or they have to be careful about that because a lot of money comes into Hollywood through the Chinese. And so that's that kind of censorship too. And I recommend American Pen's report. I think it's quite good.
Oh, that sounds great. You see it everywhere. You have the slap lawsuits against investigative journalists. The pocketbook has become a very popular way. In addition to fake news laws, like what Russia just passed recently. And as you saw, people have up and left, news organizations have up and left Russia. There's no legal safeguards. The New York Times announced yesterday they were shutting down their bureau, and they've got a nice
words cease to have meaning when Russia says what's fake news isn't war. The integrity of words is very important.
Yeah.
Yeah, because increasingly it's governments which are saying, the Indian government has asked Facebook and Twitter and other social media outlets, you should crack down on fake news, when there are people people who are part of they are not part of the state, but supporters of the government have often put out completely fabricated videos from elsewhere and saying these are attacks on Hindus by Muslims in a particular place, when it may have nothing to do with that. That's all kinds of things that are happening. Singapore too has something called POFMA, P-O-F-M-A, and which is also about false news and so on. And the attack pretty much is on people who are questioning the way Singaporean history unfolded. Now, there can be two views about it, but I obviously now want to own that history about each country seems to be wanting to go in that direction.
I'm curious about your view of those who don't self-censor. To your point, you in India, you mentioned, for example, Scroll and Wire, and there are other organizations and writers who fit that mold in India and elsewhere. What happens then is you get labeled as opposition, right? If you are not doing it, then you're the opposition. As a journalist or a writer, what are you supposed to do with that? You don't want to be the opposition. You are a writer. You want to say what it is. How do you deal with that? How do you respond?
Well, one interesting example, Sharon, as you know well, is Maria Ressa in the Philippines, who did not get cowed, and nor did her organization, and she's now nominated for, now she's won the Nobel Peace Prize. And my understanding is that there's a woman now running for president of the Philippines that has very large sort of citizen support, who's very honest, speaking the truth. So it's possible not to get cowed. I always am, I'm always in awe of those who really do. Salil and I know somebody from Myanmar who just was in prison, was Aung San Suu Kyi's secretary. PEN helped get her out of prison. She came out, she wrote. As Myanmar started to open up, she and her friends who'd been in prison opened a PEN center there. She went on the board of International PEN. It started to close again. She's now chairing the Writers in Prison Committee. And there are courageous people who just know, as the Ukrainians are showing us. And I think that's another reason there's such support there, because the courage of saying, if I don't stand up, who will stand up, all across society. So the citizens have the power, and they just have to recognize that in all of these countries.
And I think speaking truth to power, whoever is in power, I think that's the way out for those Indian journalists, that yes, they may be deemed as opposition to the present government, but if you look closely at their writing in the past, they've been against the same kind of policies pursued by the previous governments as well. So it's not that they are partisan. They are committed to a good story, and they're probably committed to certain ideals, such as, rule of law and respect for human rights and so on. And if that's what they consistently keep doing, then they don't have anything to be embarrassed about. I mean, they will still get bracketed in the wrong way. I mean, if you take in this very specific Indian example, everybody wants to come down very strongly against the Modi government for what it has been doing, and it is quite appalling in many respects. But the journalists have been arrested for writing a piece of satire 2 days ago in a Congress-ruled state called Chhattisgarh. And that's wrong. And I think it's important for people to speak out, not only when the Kashmiri journalist is taken away, but also when a journalist who may not be, who may have a different point of view is also taken away. So I think that consistency is what's crucial. And it's forgotten. That's the problem. Forgotten not by the journalists, but forgotten by the audience, because they are selective in the kind of messages that are being put out.
Also, Sharon, I think the kind of work ICFJ is doing is so important, and others, because protection is also in the collective. And as you know, there are many collectives of journalists doing investigative work, supporting each other, and not all in the same country, but working together. And that, that determination to get the truth out, to fact check, to know that, to have the collective, to pass it on. I can't do this because, but maybe you can. Is powerful. I mean, you can speak to that because you're in direct touch.
We find that all the time in all kinds of ways. It helps, collaborative reporting obviously is you get from the network. It is protecting the information. Sometimes we have news outlets who can't publish in their country. They do the reporting, it gets published someplace else.
Yeah, that's the nature of what PEN is. It's writers all over the world protecting each other to the best we can.
And then there's also just simply sharing knowledge and feeling like you're a community, that you're not alone. Because I think, and journalism or writers tend to be, a lot of journalists and writers often tend to be a bit of lone wolves, even if you work for an organization. So that feeling of community does seem to be important. And that leads me to a question I want to ask about sort of calling attention to problems, or calling attention to writers or journalists who have been targeted by governments. PEN obviously does a lot of campaigns. There are in journalism where folks are doing that as well. I'm curious about your thoughts about when is that a good idea? When is that not a good idea? Because it doesn't always seem to work. Sometimes it does, and sometimes it sadly does not.
Well, Salil can speak to this as well, but with PEN, if we can, we always get permission from the writer or their family or somebody to do the work. because sometimes we do need to be quiet. Now, I can think of several times, for instance, with Orhan Pamuk, when there was a potential case against him. We had lunch in London. We talked about it. He said, here's what's happening, but I don't want you to do anything right now because maybe it will just go away. And so Penn just put it all together, let people know, said, don't do anything yet. He said, but if you need us, let us know. And the prosecutors came in, he says, I need Penn now. And so then the centers around the world lobbied, they witnessed his trial, the charges were dropped. But we try very hard to be in touch with the writer or his family, so we don't make it worse. But for the most part, in the majority of cases, the noise, the light on the case has effect and needs to be there, but not always. Salil, I don't know what your experience.
No, I'll tell the story of Meo Messi, the Cameroonian writer who was in jail for a while, and he was getting letters upon letters from PEN members, and the jailer got very embarrassed, and he said, why are you getting it?
Yeah.
He said, so he said, what kind of VIP are you? I said, well, I'm a very important prisoner, is what he said in response. And then, he laughed about it. And, Alan Mabanko wrote a brilliant letter at that time saying that whenever a writer is taken to a jail, it's not just the writer who's taken to the jail, but all that writer's readers, all that writer's fans and supporters are also, and therefore the noise is of that silence becomes deafening. I mean, that's a point that Alain wrote when he wrote to that layer. And he's a free man now, so I mean, that's wonderful that we were able to meet him at one of the PEN congresses. And that's one of the most heartwarming things about this work, is to see some of these writers who have been inside, and luckily we are able to help them get out. And still, I remember Kakwenza Rukubaraija. I mean, I can just go on.
I know, we can both go give our list. I remember meeting Faraj Sarkoui from Iran, who said, without PEN, and he said, not only that, all the lobbying you did, it encouraged the prisoners within, because they said, we won't be forgotten either.
Yeah.
And time and again, writers say, the jailers say, who are you? I'm getting letters from, Brazil, from, Africa, from everywhere. Who are you? And so often it's the difference.
And that's also the value, right, of being a community, of a network too. You have it. There's a group of people sort of behind you, protecting, trying to protect. We've got another question from the group here, which is about Africa, and a sort of general question about why is it that most African countries have challenges when it comes to freedom of speech? What are your thoughts on that?
What's interesting is, and Salil, you tell me how you experienced it, but we used to have in PEN, a case list, and it was printed and it came out twice a year, and I would proof it, and it had like somewhere between 800 and 1,000 cases. And I sometimes wouldn't even know where I was, but as I changed, people were being put in prison for 20 years, and suddenly they're getting killed. And I'm going, wait, I'm not in China. I've moved to Colombia. And the kinds of cases and the charges do tend to change in different places. In my experience, many of the cases in Africa were for defamation, defamation of the president or something. So they were different. In Latin America, it's often impunity. People are getting killed. They're not being put in prison. In China, it's very long prison terms. In Turkey, it's interminable detentions, just writers going in and out. So it changes. So I hate to characterize a continent. I could do better with countries, but very often it's the defamation laws. You're not allowed to, insult the president. Once I remember this case, I think it was in the Cameroons, but I could be wrong, where a writer was put in prison because the soccer team lost, and he implied that the president had gone to the game or hadn't gone to the game. I can't remember, and that's why the soccer team lost. And he was put in prison. I mean, these strange cases. So I don't know how you will answer that question.
I mean, I mentioned just a short while ago Stella and Kakwenza, the two writers from Uganda, and it's again the same thing, insulting the president or insulting the country. Eritrea is of course a very sad case, where we know so many cases of Eritrean writers. We don't even know where they are, if they're still alive, because they've been away for like 15 years, 20 years, periods like that. So that's a different kind of thing, and that's basically because they are deemed to be anti-national. Apartheid era South Africa was a very different one, where you had a different kind of writer who was being persecuted at that time because they were opposed to the kind of regime that was in place at that time. And even Wole Soyinka has had trouble, and Ngugi. I mean, you know, we shouldn't forget, because he wanted to write in a particular language in a particular form, and therefore he was, you know. So you're right that, you know, it's a very vast continent with very hard to generalize, but criminal defamation is at the heart of many of the problems, the perceived insult and honor. And, you know, I have to say that a lot of these laws are the gifts of the British Empire. We have to remember that. I mean, you know, I mean, the Indian laws that restrict freedom,
blasphemy laws, and those
freedom of privacy related issues, homosexuality laws. If you look at all of that, they're the great gifts of Queen Victoria and late period of Queen Victoria. And, you know, and I think we need to move on from that. Yeah.
Thank you. That's well. Thank you for the tape. Blame the British. I think it's a lot of Indians will go back and blame the British for a lot of things. I mean, they did colonize a lot of the world. A lot of things did flow down from there.
But then they changed the laws. You see, they have moved on, but India is stuck in that age, and so is Uganda.
There are others that are stuck there, though. That
Uganda too,
really
and
colonial
Malaysia,
legacy,
all of them.
Bangladesh.
Yeah. So, well, let me ask this then, because there are different forms of censorship. You have these, you know, these defamation laws. You have fake, quote unquote, fake news laws. I hate using that term, but that's what they're called. You have shutting down stations. You have blocking social media platforms. It feels that there are a lot more ways to censor than there used to be. As technology has proliferated, it's also given us more ways to censor. Does the form of censorship matter? I mean, is there a sort of a hierarchy of censorship that we should be sort of addressing? You know, this is the most important, this is less important, or does it not matter? Is it simply just, you know, 1,000 cuts, 1,000 different ways?
I think, Sharon, in that hierarchy, across the board, I think torture needs to be just cast out, you know, in any society. And the hierarchy of censorship in some ways is the consequent, the punishment. You know, you have torture, you have clearly, if you kill somebody or executed, but often in the countries where writers are killed, you can't always track it back to the state, because you're tracking it back to the criminal networks that the state allows to exist that do the killing. I mean, you know, I think that's the case in Russia sometimes, certainly the case in Mexico. And so it's a hierarchy of punishments. In Turkey, they have kept the writers constantly in and out of jail with, you know, various charges. They don't stay as long. In China, they're very long prison sentences. So it does depend on the country. But to me, torture is at the top of that. Censorship.
And torture, death penalty, extrajudicial execution definitely comes at the top of that. Prolonged detention, trumped up charges, you know, used against them in invoking of national security laws and sedition laws, because you know that then judges are inevitably going to side with the prosecution, thinking that this person is going to blow up the country. But increasingly, we have to be watchful of another kind of threat, which is kind of censorship related, which is the invoking of financial crime laws, you know, about, you know, where have you received the money from? What have you done with it? What are you doing? If it's from abroad, what the source, have you kept the receipts? Why did you get that money, and how did it get into your account, and what did you do with it? Particularly for, you know, cooperatives and non-profit media organizations, that is a major threat. And I mean, so I think the clever governments will now try to use those kinds of means, because to be honest, once you use those kinds of means, organizations like PEN, RSF, CPJ would instinctively want to support the writer, but would want to make a very strong case that, look, the real intent is not the violation of this law, but the real intention because she wrote this poem, which the government did not like. And it becomes a harder case to make.
Also, Sharon, sometimes I was just going to look at some of the charges. I mean, this is in China. Writers arrested for picking quarrels and provoking trouble. I mean, you know, that can cover anything you want. There are others are spreading propaganda against the system, collusion against national security. That's in Iran. I remember in my time, I don't know if they still use this in China, it was for troubling the Democratic Republic of China. You know, so these are very wide nets that.
Or undermining respect for the police, or undermining respect for the state, you know, which,
We are just about out of time. I just wanted to leave on one question and let you both answer it. So Joanne, you include this epigraph in your book from Salman Rushdie that I really loved. It says, Freedom of speech is no abstraction. Writers and journalists who insist upon this freedom and see it in the world's best weapon against tyranny and corruption know also that it is a freedom which must be constantly defended or it will be lost. So I guess my question to you are enough people, enough governments, enough journalists and writers defending it? You know, we live in an age where there's lack of trust in media and writers too, right? You're either with me or against me, and then I don't trust you. So in this backdrop that we're in, with world events as they are, how do you feel? Are you pessimistic or are you optimistic? As I said, as we kind of started in the beginning, there was an optimism in your experiences in the 90s, it felt like. And so where do you come down now?
Well, I am still optimistic because in working with an organization like ICFJ, working with an organization like PEN, I have the pleasure of working with individuals who are really out there trying to help their fellow writers. And I often think of PEN as a whole network of people, you know, sort of like this, that sort of holds up the mountain from falling down into the ditch. And it's still there. I mean, and the nice thing is it passes on from generation to generation. And so you're sort of seeing the best, maybe not the best of the character of the writers that you're dealing with, because they're doing that. I thought maybe I'll read this one quote from Arthur Miller. I shared it with you yesterday, but I think it's very good because Arthur Miller has so far been the only American president of PEN International. And he said the following, this was 25 years ago. The PEN is still around after 3/4 of a century when it has no army, no navy or air force, no political rewards or threats of punishment. It's possibly a triumph of illusion over reality. The illusion that hope is rational in this world. And I think that's a good way to end it.
Yeah, it is. I love that. I love that phrase. Do you want to top Arthur Miller, Salil? You want to try?
Well, I want to compliment it. You know, I'm not, who can top these wonderful words? But one thing I want to talk about is, you know, why despair is not an option. And I go back again, having been born in India, I'll go back to Gandhi, who said that when I despair, I remember that all through history, the way of truth and love have always won. There have been tyrants and murderers, and for the time, they can seem invincible. But in the end, they always fall. Think of it, always. Now, that sounds inspirational at one level, but then there's Václav Havel, you know, and again, a great writer, great dissident, and also,
Okay,
I view a very good president of the Czech Republic and Czechoslovakia earlier. And this is what he said about hope. And it makes you believe and it makes you feel why we have to go on, which is that hope is not the conviction that something will turn out well, but the certainty that something makes sense, regardless of how it turns out.
That's
you know, there's a wonderful quote. I'll go to more current culture, but you know, the movie, the Marigold Hotel movie, if you remember, he says, everything will be all right in the end. If it's not all right, it just means it's not the end. So, right. Or something like that. He said
that. It is. That's one of my favorite quotes.
I think that's yeah.
Well, okay. So I think this is a perfect place to end. A few notes of inspiration and optimism. I think we all could use a bit of that right now. So thank you, Joanne. Thank you, Salil, so much. And thank you everyone for joining us. This will be, we've recorded it and we will archive it if you want to share it around, and we'll send you some updates and some takeaways from this for everybody who participated. So thanks again to everybody, and enjoy the rest of your morning, evening, or afternoon.
Good. Thank you. Nice to see you in a square on the screen.
Yeah, you too. Bye-bye.